Hello, I'm Dr. Deborah Davis, and I'm here to speak with you about the latest science on 5G and the Internet of Things and what we know about impacts on human health and the environment. For the past 4 decades, I have worked at some of the top echelons of science in the United States and around the world. I was the founding director of the Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology at the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, where I led efforts that ultimately resulted in the ban on smoking in airplanes and the indoor environment. I have worked throughout my career publishing in toxicology and epidemiology and received bipartisan confirmation by the U.S. Senate for presidential appointment. And I've written more than 220 technical articles and 3 popular books, including The Secret History of the War on Cancer and Disconnect, the Truth About Cell Phone Radiation. Today, I'm going to talk with you about a very troubling and persisting environmental pollutant that is not widely recognized, and that is wireless radiation. The radiation limits that we have for microwave radiation today were set in 1996, and those same limits, which were developed in the 20th century, are going to be applied to 5G and other technologies in the 21st century. We believe this is wrong, and we are working with others who share that belief to advance the idea that we have to have a moratorium on 5G because those standards only account for heating effects. They are based on a large plastic empty bowling ball into which fluid is poured and temperatures are checked to see at what point the heat is changed in that bowling ball to a level that is judged by engineers to be adverse to human health. The International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation has set standards for exposure based solely on avoiding heat and does not take into account the numerous other effects that have been identified. We Are Not SAM is a global campaign that is seeking to raise awareness about the damaging effects of 5G, the lack of safety testing, and is calling for a boycott on 5G until we have safety data. Children's deeper absorption of cell phone microwaves has been documented by our colleagues at Porto Alegre, Claudio Fernandez, Alvaro de Salas, and myself, working with modeling that has been approved by the FDA that looks at 1 millimeter voxels and then models exposure. And you can see from this image here that the radio frequency radiation gets absorbed very deeply into the eyes and to the cheek and into the skull of the child. And in fact, work that we published with these colleagues shows that the eyes of a child will absorb 2 to 5 times more radiation than that of an adult, and that the hippocampus, which is critical to memory, impulse control, and reaction, gets up to 30 times more exposure in a child than compared to an adult. This same imaging has been done here with a tablet, and we should stress that tablets belong on tables. They should not be held near the bodies of young children, whether lying down or on their laps, because again, exposure here to the child just from looking into the screen can result in peak exposures into the nose, to the eyes, to the frontal lobe. And we know that these can be having an effect on the child because they have thinner skulls with more fluid that absorb more microwave radiation. The part of the human body that absorbs the most radiation in the male is the penis, as seen here in this imaging that was conducted also with our colleagues in Brazil. And studies have been done around the world confirming that human male sperm, when exposed to cell phone radiation, develops more damage to the DNA of the sperm. That is why the Cleveland Clinic, the Mayo Clinic, of clinics in Australia and India have for more than a decade told men who want to have healthy babies to get their phones out of their pockets. In addition, exposure is quite high into the colon and rectal area, and that has grave consequences, as we will see in a moment. In my book, Disconnect, which was published in 2010, we talked about the fact that the cell phone industry response to the science was to, quote, war game findings that it did not like, including the finding in 1994 by Henry Lai and Vijay Singh that cell phone radiation could damage the DNA in the nucleus of cells in the brain of rats, exposed at that time to levels of radiation that subsequently became used in cell phones. Further, I want to bring your attention to the fact that the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation, known as ICNIRP, is a small group of invitation-only members that does not report to anybody. And there is no review of that group, and yet they are the group that recommends the standards that have been widely adopted by many nations around the world today. For this reason alone, we call for government limits to be revised. We have filed a historic lawsuit against the FCC, Environmental Health Trust, with 14 different petitioners, one of which is Children's Health Defense, one of whom is Theodora Scarato, another is Cindy Franklin, Elizabeth Barris, Dr. David Carpenter, and a number of others. And in that lawsuit, we are challenging the validity of these 25-year-old standards of the FCC, because you see, those standards affect the phone, the towers, the entire system in which we are now surrounded by microwave radiation. And they have not been revised for 25 years, and they do not take into account a voluminous scientific research showing that cell phone radiation at current levels can damage DNA, can cause a host of other biological effects, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And in our lawsuit, we make it clear that the FCC has violated federal law. It's failed to take into account the environmental impacts of wireless radiation, including that of towers, and it has failed utterly to look at the record in a full, rational, reasoned manner that shows that it took full account of the thousands of scientific studies that were submitted by Environmental Health Trust and by scientists from around the world. The FCC did not establish any effort to look at all of the data, and instead made a ruling that said we can rely on 25-year-old standards to evaluate cell phones, Bluetooth devices, towers, baby monitors, door openers, and a host of other things that are estimated to be part of the 50 billion wireless devices to be connected under the Internet of Things, whether you want it or not. Now, in fact, what has happened is that the judges, in reviewing our case, asked very pointed questions about the failure of the FCC to look into the record in a systematic way, about the failure of the FCC to even consider environmental impacts because the National Environmental Policy Act requires it, and the failure to take into account the Americans for Disabilities Act that protects those with electromagnetic illness who have become refugees with the incredible growth of wireless radiation. This lawsuit seeks to have the FCC change its approach to evaluating these devices, and also expects to encourage industry to develop safer devices. And that's one of the reasons for our lawsuit. Research published with my distinguished colleague, Dr. Anthony B. Miller, and other experts in the field in 2018 looked at all of the data that were established, both experimentally and in human studies, and concluded at that time that we would find the wireless radiation from routers and baby monitors and phones and towers to be a class 1 human carcinogen. And that is a finding that was corroborated by the National Toxicology Program, the flagship program of the United States, as well in more recent studies, as well as by the Ramazzini Institute, that showed that low levels of base station-like radiation can induce extremely rare forms of cancer. And we know that anything that causes an increase in cancer in animals should be considered as a risk to humans, because every known human cause of cancer will produce it in animals when adequately studied. And some of the most important studies in the world have been carried out at the Ramazzini Institute over the past 3 decades. When it comes to concerns about microwave radiation from all of these devices, cancer is the tip of the iceberg. As important studies done in Italy at the Ramazzini Institute have shown, there's a variety of genetic damage, there's effects on reproduction and the weight of the babies that are produced after exposure, there's effects on brain of animals and humans, there's effects on headache, And there's something called oxidative stress, which is the release in the blood of chemicals that can go out and attack other parts of the body. This kind of effect also occurs in animals, according to studies that I'll show you in a moment, in bees and other insects, and as well as effects on trees. Now, you may wonder why you don't know more about this and why it's such a surprise to get this information now. And the answer is provided in part in this Harvard University Law School Center for Ethics report by Norman Ulster that referred to the Federal Communications Commission as a captured agency. That report noted the revolving door where the leaders of the FCC come from and go back to the telecommunications industry. This has been going on in the United States under Democrat and Republican administrations for several decades. And when you look at who pays for the research, with a number of people have done, you find that what the results say often reflects who funded it. Where you sit on the issue depends on who paid for your chair. And increasingly, the public is demanding, and Environmental Health Trust is insisting, that we have independent expert opinions in the research, because what we know is that the big tobacco model of public relations, deny, dismiss, and discredit, continues to operate today. And in fact, some of the same characters that have been involved as scientific experts on behalf of big tobacco have now emerged as experts in the field of cell phone radiation. That is another reason why we have filed our lawsuit seeking independent expert advice, such as that can be provided from leaders around the world who've done research such as that at Ramazzini. An important study on 5G millimeter wave deployment for networks has been published in a technical journal of electrical engineers, an IEEE journal. And what these researchers did was take the current network in Austin, Texas, and show what the current exposures are from the towers that exist that are connecting 4G devices. You can see that in this image here. The next image shows you the dramatic increase in radiation that will take place if and when 5G is fully implemented in Austin, Texas. The researchers, who are themselves electrical engineers, say that the 5G mobile networks cannot yet be classified as safe because the exposures that are involved have the potential to harm the public. We at Environmental Health Trust are calling for a halt in the rollout of the 5G network, a moratorium. And we have proposed making wired connections to and through the premises as a way to avoid microwave wireless radiation throughout the urban environment, which is projected now. And as these engineers have concluded, this would result in levels that cannot be deemed safe. When it comes to understanding what the levels are that we get from phones today, it's very important to be aware that the French government, unlike many other governments, actually tests phones. And they don't just test them in a SAM model, off the body, away from the head. They test them directly next to the body. And when phones are tested next to the body, as this paper published in the IEEE Access by one of the most renowned electrical engineers in the world, Professor Om Gandhi, this paper shows that phones violate even the ICNIRP limits for heat when they are tested at body contact. And what Professor Gandhi did was to take phones that had been shown by the French to exceed those standards for thermal limits and explain that if they were applied to the US limits, that the phones would exceed current US limits up to 11 times. That is to say, current cell phones are emitting more microwave radiation than even the thermal limits allow. And when you tie that together with all the other exposures that we have from laptops and routers and towers, we can see that we are creating a huge public health and environmental problem. One evidence of that problem is a study published by researchers from Yale University on thyroid cancer. Thyroid cancer rates are skyrocketing, as Leonard Hardell has recently reported in another peer-reviewed publication. We don't know why, but we do know this. In this very well done case control study from Yale, they showed that people who had a particular single nucleotide excision repair problem had up to 4 times more thyroid cancer when they used cell phones for an hour a day than those who did not. So if you happen to have this rather common SNP, single nucleotide excision repair problem, then you are much more likely to develop thyroid cancer. And we're seeing that the newer phones are designed with more and more antennas so that they have more radiation going directly into the thyroid gland. Now, further evidence of the capacity of microwave radiation to have profound and subtle effects comes from a very important series of studies that were done by our colleagues in Turkey, Suleiman Destek and Suleiman Kaplan, among others. And what they were able to show is that prenatally exposing animals to cell phone radiation results in newborn rats with particular types of damage to the hippocampus, to cells in the brain that are critical to thinking and memory. And in fact, exposed animals have smaller brains and more evidence of brain damage after prenatal exposure. Studies at Yale University have shown that animals' behavior is also affected, and prenatally exposed animals, according to a study by Hugh Taylor, clearly developed what we would call attention deficit in rodents. We also have to ask, could the increases in colorectal cancer in young adults be tied to cell phone radiation? We have reported in a paper published recently, just last year, that young adults aged 24 have had a 4-fold increase in very rare cancers of the rectum in the last decade. And similar increases have now been reported in Brazil, in England, in Iran, and in Egypt. Now, all of those increases are certainly not due to cell phones. There may be a role for pesticides, particularly in Egypt and Brazil, where those are not well regulated. But this increase in such an unusual cancer in young people certainly could plausibly be tied in part to their increased habit of keeping phones close to the body. And as I showed you in the modeling that we've done with our colleagues from Brazil, the rectum does get very high exposure, as does the penis and the testis. And not only that, we show in the recently published paper, just published toward the end of last year, that when you radiate rectal cells that you take experimentally, you can actually dramatically increase their growth. They are more sensitive to cell phone radiation. And studies have shown experimentally that the same type of damage that we get from gamma rays, that's X-rays, that's CAT scans and other things, the same type of damage that we get from that kind of radiation is also produced from cell phone radiation when we look at the tissue of rats. Now, this is biological evidence that cell phone radiation can be damaging to the colorectal cells. And now we have this pattern of unexplained increases in this in young adults. I'm one of hundreds of scientists now calling to halt 5G, including many in Italy and around the world, because we recognize that it has not been fully tested for its impact on public health or the environment. This includes a consensus statement from England, international medical and scientific experts, as well as the Hippocrates electrosmog appeal of doctors from Belgium, doctors from Chile, Germany, France, and around the world. A very important study on the damaging effects of cell tower radiation at current levels was produced by colleagues in India, where they took blood from people who lived 80 meters close to cell towers and compared it to those who lived over 300 meters away. And they controlled for their other exposures to other devices. And they concluded that the blood of people who lived closer to towers had more evidence of damage to DNA, had lower levels of glutathione, which is a very powerful part of the body that is involved in repairing damage, that keeps us all healthy, and had increases in peroxidation, that's oxidative stress, That's damage from free radicals. And that is a very important indication all over that the blood of these people who live near towers is more damaged than those who live further away. A recent report produced for the Swiss government, for an expert advisory committee to them, has concluded that there is evidence that cell phone radiation, electromagnetic fields, causes oxidative stress. In studies of experimental studies where we looked at cell cultures and we looked at whole animals exposed under controlled condition, which is the gold standard for how we study drugs or toxic chemicals, those same studies were reviewed. And they also said that those who have pre-existing conditions, such as diabetes or cancer, or those who are very young or the elderly, may be at increased risk from the stress that is caused to the body from these free radicals that are produced by electromagnetic fields. This is a very important study that was led by Professor Mikey Mevison, one of the most distinguished toxicologists in this field, and it is sending shockwaves throughout the community, as it should. When it comes to protecting wildlife, what is quite amazing is that the Federal Communications Commission and the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection don't even recognize that there are any studies at all showing damage to birds or insects. They don't even recognize it. They don't even take into account the fact that these limits were not set to protect the most delicate parts of the environment. And research has shown that current levels from 3G and 4G radiation can affect insects, can affect birds and their reproduction, and can affect bees. And the failure to take into account wildlife is a serious problem in setting these standards. It's as though the only organism that is important in the world is the human organism, but we know that without all of the others, we would not survive. If you look at bees, which we know are critical to agriculture, there is evidence that they can resonate with the higher frequencies of 5G. On the slides that you see before you, you see the honeybee and the body of the honeybee, which was modeled with three-dimensional imaging. The 2 gigahertz exposure would be the exposure to current levels, and the exposure is highest on the outside of the body. But 24 gigahertz and 120 gigahertz are levels of millimeter wave frequency that could exist with 5G. And in fact, 5G would rely on 24 gigahertz. And the authors of this article warn that this resonates exactly with the body of the honeybee and can be expected to disrupt its ability to make honey and to live. In fact, other research has found that if you put a cell phone in a honeybee hive and another hive has no phone in it and turn the phone on, those bees will not come back and will stop making honey. There are more than 200 different pollinating insects that are thought to be critical to agriculture, and these may all be affected by 5G radiation. Studies have shown a significant, systematic, damaging effect of this radiation on large trees. Studies of trees have been done by our colleagues in Germany. You can see from this image, on the far left, you see the 2 cell towers. And if you look at the top of the tree carefully, on the right side, which is far away from the tower, the tree is thick and growing well. But on the left side, facing the tower, it's almost like the tree is trying to pull away from the antennas. And the leaves are not thick. And this is a sign of poor health of the tree. And these researchers published this study concluding that there is clear evidence of damage to trees from exposure to cell towers at 3G and 4G. A machine learning analysis that I published with my colleague Malka Haugemoog also shows clear evidence that radiofrequency radiation can damage the capacity of green growing things to do well. Now, we at Environmental Health Trust have been working since 2007, working with colleagues in Italy and around the world to promote awareness of the need to take steps to reduce avoidable environmental health hazards. Electromagnetic fields from towers and phones and toys are huge and unappreciated threat to public health and the environment today. If you want more information, please look at our resources for teachers and parents and children. We're looking forward to working further with the Ramazziti Institute and others as we promote awareness of what the science does show us now. And we take steps to encourage and frankly, to demand that industry produce safer products so that our children can be protected in schools and that we can feel more safe in our homes and the world can be spared the unnecessary exposure to radiation that produces risks and damage to our health and that of trees and bees and the rest of us.
I'm Theodora Scarato, Executive Director of Environmental Health Trust. We are a scientific think tank focused on publishing research, educating the public, and educating policymakers around the world about environmental health. Hundreds of scientists are calling to halt 5G. They are calling to halt the deployment of hundreds of thousands of new wireless antennas, which will be placed directly in front of our homes, our schools, where we live, play, and work. The people are listening to these scientists, and they are calling on their elected officials to halt 5G to protect human health as well as the environment. The fact that over 600 municipalities in Italy have taken action calling for safety before the deployment of 5G is absolutely inspiring us in the United States and around the world. People have been protesting for years to halt 5G. Here's video footage from Amsterdam, Australia, California, Brussels, South Africa, Italy, New South Wales, Australia, New Zealand, Greece, Cyprus, Spain, England, Peru, France, in the United States, this is in Oregon, this is in Hawaii. Since 2018, members of Congress and elected officials have been sending letters to the FCC asking for 5G safety data. They include Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, Representative Anna Eshoo from California, Representative Peter DeFazio from Oregon, Representative Andy King from New Jersey, and Representative Thomas Suizzo from New York. The letter sent from Senator Blumenthal and Representative Anna Eshoo states, "We respectfully request you provide to our offices the 5G safety determination from FCC and relevant health agencies." As another example, New York State Senator James Garan stated in his letter, "We are also concerned with the long-term 24/7 exposure to 2G, 3G, and 4G that are currently in our neighborhoods. The health of our community is of utmost concern and cannot be sacrificed." In response to all of these inquiries around the safety of 5G, in 2019, the US FCC, quite shockingly, decided to maintain their 1996 human exposure limits for wireless and cell phone and cell tower radiation. They're very similar to the limits of the International Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, in that they are non-protective, they are based on outdated science, they're based only on short-term heating effects, not long-term effects or biological effects, and they're really based on science that go back decades from the 70s and 80s. They also only look at power level, but they don't look at more complex aspects of an exposure, such as modulation, polarization, and data rate. Environmental Health Trust, as well as numerous public health experts and scientists and citizens around the United States, as well as internationally, had submitted to the FCC research showing harm at levels far, far lower than FCC limits. Yet the FCC still decided to maintain these non-protective, irrelevant, and inadequate limits. We filed our legal appeal last year and had our court hearing last month. The judges asked very pointed questions of the US FCC, questions that showed us that they had read our brief. They asked about cumulative exposure, about kids using laptops on laps, about the Internet of Things and all of the wireless devices and networks that people are exposed to today compared to decades ago when those limits were first developed. Now, the US FCC has also proposed new rules related to the higher frequencies that will be used in 5G. Those new rules set exposure limits, which are again non-protective because they don't protect from long-term exposure or biological effects. There were many expert responses, including a response from the city of Boston, Massachusetts, regarding 5G. Let me read part of their letter. Research has revealed that there may be concerns with possible health effects of low-level multiple source exposure arising from the huge diffusion of communication technologies, such as mobile communications, wireless data transfer, such as Wi-Fi, WiMAX, Bluetooth, and Zigbee, and the wireless networks to which these devices connect. Therefore, Boston requests that the Commission also examine the potential impact on the health of low-level multiple exposures. And that's a letter from 2020. Now, across the United States, there are numerous actions happening at the local level. There are council resolutions to halt 5G at Keene, New Hampshire, Hawaii County, Hawaii, Easton, Connecticut, Farragut City, Tennessee. There are resolutions regarding the health and environmental effects of 5G from Hillendale Beach, Florida, Coconut Creek, Florida, Carmel City, Indiana. They're calling for a review of the research before we deploy this technology onto people and the environment. And there are many resolutions calling for changes to federal law so cities can control 5G, such as in New Jersey City, New Jersey, and Oak Brook, Illinois. These are only a few examples. There are many cities that are passing ordinances to restrict and control 5G small cells. They include Los Altos, Petaluma, Mill Valley, Malibu, Santa Barbara, Nevada City, Calabasas, San Clemente, Westlake, Sonoma, Sebastopol, San Rafael, Ross Valley, Encinitas, Fairfax, Palo Alto, Walnut City, and San Diego County, California. Copake, New York, Warren, Connecticut, Lavallette, Florida, and Mason, Ohio. Each city has its own unique ordinance meant to allow the people to be part of the decision-making process. In Los Altos, California, for example, their ordinance says that the installation of small cells on public utility easements in residential neighborhoods is prohibited. A small cell is a shorter cell tower with 5G and 4G antennas on it. There's a 500-foot separation from schools. There's a 1,500-foot separation between nodes, between the antenna facilities. Many cities have a specific amount of feet that a cell tower or small cell 5G wireless base station must be from a school or home. So for example, in Calabasas, it's 1,000 feet, Petaluma, 500 feet, San Ramon, 300 feet. Walnut, California, and Hampstead, New York have a 1,500-foot setback for cell towers from homes. Palo Alto, California, and Bar Harbor, Maine, as well as Sallisaw, Oklahoma, have 1,500 feet setbacks from schools. Stop 5G International has video footage from the protests in Berkeley, California, where people have been protesting cell towers, and there have been arrests and many other actions going on in the city. The International Association of Firefighters has an official position against cell towers on fire stations. And in the United States, California firefighters have long opposed cell towers on their stations. This announcement was released by firefighters in Los Angeles, telling them to call on the Board of Supervisors and stop the cell towers that would be forced on top of their stations.
Firefighters living and working beneath cell towers like this one have gotten sick. Headaches, extreme fatigue, memory loss, and brain scans show that firefighters exposed to toxic RF radiation experience cell death, ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has approved cell tower installations on fire stations in neighborhoods like yours. Call the Board of Supervisors and tell them to stop the cell towers now.
Los Angeles County Firefighters Local 1014 had a webpage dedicated to stopping cell towers because of a plan to install them on their stations. And they have testified at many meetings calling to halt cell antenna placement on top of their stations. The American Academy of Pediatrics is the largest medical organization of children's doctors in the United States. They recommend that children's exposure to cell phone radiation be reduced, and they actually have issued 10 ways to do that on their website, Healthy Children. They also have a website page on electromagnetic fields where they talk about cell towers, and let me quote what they say. In recent years, concern has increased about exposure to radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation emitted from cell phones and cell phone station antenna. An Egyptian study confirmed concerns that living nearby mobile phone base stations increase the risk for developing headaches, memory damage, dizziness, depression, sleep problems. This medical organization has repeatedly written the US FCC, calling on them to update their limits for allowable levels of wireless radiation and calling on them to protect children. The Los Angeles, California Public School District has a resolution banning cell towers on school campuses. And in addition, the District Office of Environmental Health and Safety also states that they have a precautionary threshold level that addresses non-thermal levels, and their threshold is 10,000 times lower than the FCC standard. They state it is believed that a more conservative level is necessary to protect children who represent a potentially vulnerable and sensitive population. Now, although they have a resolution banning cell towers on school grounds, there are many teachers who are in the process of or who have filed action against the school district. They've been injured by the Wi-Fi. Some have been accommodated and others have not. They are, as I understand it, just averaging the wireless radiation levels, which is not accounting for biological effects. In fact, there was a critical win in court by a teacher who filed against the school district, and her court case is now going to be allowed to proceed. And we will be watching this case very closely. I now want to speak to you about an extremely important report released from the New Hampshire Commission on 5G and the Environment. They issued a final report after 1 year of investigation into 5G. There were presentations by expert scientists, including the National Institutes of Health. On the commission were engineers, scientists, and medical doctors, and elected officials. Their final report details 15 recommendations to the state to protect the public. I'm going to summarize some of their very important recommendations. They recommend there be an independent, not wireless industry-funded study on 5G health effects. They recommend an environmental assessment on the impact of 5G. They call to engage federal agencies with ecological knowledge to develop wireless radiofrequency radiation safety limits that will protect trees, plants, birds, insects, and pollinators. They're calling on the state to have setbacks so that there is a distance between cell antennas and schools and homes. They recommend that measurements be taken of the radiofrequency radiation levels, especially near homes, and have this information posted publicly on maps that people can access to see how much radiation they're being exposed to every day when they're outside or near their school or near their home. They're calling for 5G structures to be labeled for radiofrequency radiation, and that should be at eye level so people can read it up to 9 feet away from the 5G antenna system. They are also recommending the establishment of wireless-free zones. And they are calling on the medical community to develop protections and protocols for people who are being harmed by non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation. As an example of what is possible, what you're seeing here are pictures from the Archbishop Makarios Hospital in Cyprus, which has removed Wi-Fi from the pediatric and neonatal units. I was honored to present a premiere of a video by the National Committee for Environment and Children's Health of Cyprus, where they showcased how they remove the radiation. They're educating the parents and the staff, and the medical doctors are taking action to protect their patients. Here's a short clip from the video, which is online.
Τα παιδιά και τα νεογνά, ιδιαίτερα τα πρόωρα, είναι πολύ ευάλωτα και πρέπει να τα προφυλάξουμε. Γι' αυτό, βασισμένη στη διεθνώς αποδεκτή αρχή της προφύλαξης, στους αλάμους εντατικής θεραπείας παιδών και νεογνών του Μακάριου νοσοκομείου, αποσυνδέσαμε το Wi-Fi. Χρησιμοποιούμε μόνο ασφαλές ενσύρματο διαδίκτυο, συμβουλεύουμε όλους όταν πλησιάζουν τα παιδιά να βάζουν τα κινητά τηλέφωνά τους σε λειτουργία πτήσης. Έτσι, φωτογραφίσουν και διασκεδάζουν τα παιδιά με μουσική και βίντεο, χωρίς να τα εκθέτουν σε επικίνδυνη ακτινοβολία. Γιατί τα παιδιά έχουν δικαίωμα στην υγεία.
Η υγεία είναι δικαίωμα. Μην μας το στερείτε.
Είμαστε περήφανοι για την πρωτοποριακή αυτή έρευνα που γίνεται με την επιστημονική καθοδήγηση και συνεργασία της Εθνικής Επιτροπής Περιβάλλον και Υγεία του Παιδιού. Καταφέραμε να μειώσουμε την έκθεση στην ακτινοβολία σε αποδεκτά επίπεδα ασφάλειας και θα συνεχίσουμε.
Μαζί δείχνουμε το δρόμο. Και το Μακάριο νοσοκομείο εξελίσσεται διεθνώς σε μια πρότυπη όαση υγείας και προφύλαξης των παιδιών από την ακτινοβολία.
And in the United States, there have been 2 large medical conferences to educate doctors about the health impacts of electromagnetic radiation and wireless radiation, as well as how to treat people who have been injured by wireless radiation. There was a medical conference in 2019, and just recently a 4-day conference in January of 2021. All of the video recordings from that conference, which was entitled Prevention, Diagnosis, and Treatment of Electromagnetic Fields Associated Illness, they are all going to be online to train medical doctors across the world. The New Hampshire Commission on 5G and the Environment also recommends that the public's exposure to radio frequency radiation be reduced. They're calling for software changes on wireless devices so that they'll reduce radio frequency radiation when they get close to the body. They're calling for a multimedia campaign by health agencies to educate the public on how to minimize radio frequency wireless cell phone, cell tower, Wi-Fi radiation, especially for newborns and pregnant women. And they want radio, print, television to be used in this multimedia campaign. Parents need to be made aware of the risk to their children and their families from this radiation. 5G is going to increase our involuntary exposure to wireless radiation. Even if we're not using a phone, we will not be able to stop our exposure if there's a cell tower antenna in front of our home. Instead of all of these transmitting 5G cell towers right outside of homes, the Commission is recommending that there be the deployment of fiber optic cable connectivity that goes to the premise, to our homes, and that we have wired internet service inside homes so that people can access the internet safely, faster, and more securely. The New Hampshire Commission also recommends that schools and libraries remove the Wi-Fi and instead use safer technology, such as Ethernet connections, not Wi-Fi. In 2017, the Maryland State Children's Environmental Health and Protection Advisory Council, made up of 19 members, including pediatricians and members of the Maryland government, also had recommendations that schools use wired connections, not Wi-Fi. They recommend also that the state provide suggestions to the public on how to reduce exposure. The California Department of Public Health released an advisory on how to reduce exposure to cell phone radiation, and they specifically recommended in their press release that children's cell phone radiation exposure be reduced. They recommend keeping the phone at a distance, not sleeping with the phone next to your head, not putting the phone in your pocket, and using speakerphone when you use the cell phone. In response to the California recommendations, the San Francisco Teachers Union, the United Educators of San Francisco and California, passed a resolution in 2018. It was on enhancing technology safety so that this important advice on reducing cell phone radiation would be disseminated to all students and staff and teachers. And the resolution also talks about posting the cell phone radiation advisory in all classrooms in the county. There are many teacher unions and educational organizations in North America taking action on the issue of Wi-Fi and cell towers and 5G near schools. Parent organizations have written letters calling for the halt to 5G near their schools. Organizations such as the New Jersey Educational Association have released information on how to reduce exposure to wireless in the classroom setting. Some unions have released reports about the effects of Wi-Fi. The New York State Teacher Union passed guidelines for the safer use of wireless technology. Just recently, the Green Party of California issued a statement on 5G wireless technology. They are calling on federal, state, and local representatives to apply the precautionary principle for 5G. They are calling to reduce exposure and use safer technology. They are calling for a robust, independent, scientific, environmental review of 4G and 5G wireless exposure, and to halt FCC satellite networks on Earth and in space in light of the new findings on climate, pollution, and health impacts. In addition, they're calling to adopt the expert recommendations, such as those by the New Hampshire Commission on 5G Health and the Environment. People are waking up to this issue all across the United States because cell towers are being built right in front of people's homes. People are waking up in the morning to a cell tower being right in front of their child's bedroom window. This is unacceptable. We must raise awareness in our communities on how to use safer technology so people know how to protect their families and protect themselves. And then we must ensure that our communities and our neighborhoods and our homes and schools are protected so that levels of wireless radiation are reduced to as low as possible. And we need federal protections for the public and for the environment.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation? As long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting.
The American Academy of Pediatrics in over a dozen countries recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation.
When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this. To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children.
When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless.
Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure.
For their safety.
For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them. Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures.
Probably the most important thing I did, I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities.
A growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure.
I think the most important study is a study by the National Toxicology Program. In a classic large carcinogenicity test, one of the largest ever performed, and for that matter, one of the most expensive, they found increased risk of the tumors which we believe radiofrequency radiation is causing in man. Particular tumors called schwannomas. In the rats, they were in the heart. In humans, they're often in the nerve, the ear nerve, the vestibular nerve.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC.
The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago.
The manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I've never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
It does say exactly that. There's the BlackBerry, for example, warns to keep your phone at least 0.98 inches away from the body when transmitting. With an iPhone, for example, it's 5/8 of an inch.
At this point, the evidence has become sufficiently strong that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen.
A major development from California's Department of Public Health. High use of cell phones may be linked to certain types of cancer and other health effects, including brain cancer and tumors, lower sperm counts, headaches, and effects on learning, memory, hearing, behavior, and sleep.
If it was a real problem, I would know. If it was a real problem, the government would protect us. How come I'm not hearing about this? They're all things I've heard when I give seminars. You know, I get up there and they say, oh yeah, if this was really a problem, they would have told us. I am they. I am a, legitimate scientist, and I am telling you.